Welcome to everyone who has tuned into our webinar today. Our speaker is Dr. David Hillson, globally well known as the Risk Doctor. Dr. Hillson has for a long time and still promotes the approach that risk is not necessarily a negative. Risk is as well an opportunity for a positive outcome. My name is Vivian Walters on the Program Management Interest Group and your host for today. A few items on the SIG. We are currently going through a self-nomination for anyone interested in joining the Program Management SIG committee. The nomination can be done online or of the APM website, where you'll find the eligibility criteria. Secondly, I'll be writing a blog on the presentation to continue the discussion of the topic. The Program Management SIG produces monthly blogs on the subject of program management written by members of the committee. I will hand you over now to Dr. Hillson. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Vivian, and good day, everybody. It's David Hillson, the Risk Doctor, and it's a great pleasure to have this opportunity to share with you on this important topic of managing risk in programs. It's something that I think we've been talking about for quite a long time, and I'm not sure still that everybody's quite got it. So hopefully we can introduce some new ideas and discuss them in a fairly straightforward way and give you some things that you can use practically going forward. So I'm going to be covering, here we go, covering these 4 topics, some of which you'll be very familiar with and others I think perhaps you won't be. First of all, what's the difference between programs and projects, and following that, what's the difference between program risk and project risk, and then as a result of that, what do we need to do differently in terms of program risk management as opposed to project risk management. And we'll be looking particularly at the aim and scope of program risk management, as well as the approach that we might take. As I indicated, perhaps program risk management isn't fully defined and matured just yet, so I'm going to end up by talking about some of the remaining challenges that there might be in terms of maturing this area of knowledge and practice. So program management is still a hot topic, although we've been talking about it for, well, 25 years. Initially, there was the Program and Project Management Library issued by the UK CCTA way back in 1993, when most of us were a lot younger and had more hair, and things were very different back in the mid-90s. But there we started to get some discussion about what a program was as distinct from a project, what program management might be as distinct from project management. And out of the CCTA's work came the definition of a standard called Managing Successful Programs, first issued in 1999, managed by the UK Office of Government Commerce initially. And we're now at the 4th edition of that, which was published in 2011. We've also had other standards and guidelines. In the APM body of knowledge, which is now at the 6th edition, program management is separated out as a different knowledge area. And within each of the different aspects of the body of knowledge, we've talked about application to projects, programs, and portfolios. So we're beginning to develop a body of knowledge, a sort of sub-body of knowledge within the APM's overall body of knowledge. And you perhaps know that the 7th edition of the APM body of knowledge is being prepared just now, and you should be seeing drafts of that for comment somewhere towards the end of this year. Our good friends in the Project Management Institute have also been working on program management, although of course they can't spell it properly. They spell it missing out a couple of letters at the end, but they published their first standard for program management some years ago. The PMBOK guide is the project management body of knowledge. So they've been talking separately about program management. The PMI standard for program management was reissued in its 4th edition in September of last year. And the PMI also have its separate certification, the Program Management Professional, which was just updated earlier this year in line with the 4th edition of the PMI standard. In fact, I think it was released on the 24th of June, the PMI Program Management Professional update. So we've got quite a wide history of program management, particularly in the UK, but also more widely through PMI and also in other places, Australia and New Zealand and so on. And so it's something which we know quite a lot about, and there's still there's widespread practice across a variety of industries and a variety of countries. But still, if we look at the way that program management is addressed in the professional bodies, there's still something of a different approach. So if we took program management in the APM body of knowledge and the PMI standard, there would be some differences. And I think that's perhaps an indication of the lack of maturity of the area of program management. So how do we define programs and projects? The definitions are quite indicative, I think. PMI talks about related projects, subsidiary programs or subprograms, and program activities managed in a coordinated way to obtain benefits and control not available from managing them individually. APM in the body of knowledge talks about a group of related projects similar to PMI, but also change management activities that achieve beneficial change for the organization. And OGC in the MSP approach talks rather differently about program management being an organizational structure, but still it's about implementing a set of related projects and activities. And from these things, you'll see it's quite obvious that a program is not the same as a project. Projects are distinct. Projects have a beginning and end. Projects have set objectives, so they have set components, they have constraints and requirements and so on. And they're not the same as these definitions of program from APM, PMI, and OGC. So a program is not the same as a project, not even a big project. And one of the problems with the language, particularly with our friends in the United States, is that they tend to use the word program rather loosely to talk about just big projects. So the idea here is that programs, as I'm sure you're familiar with this idea, that programs sit above projects. Programs include groups of related projects along with other things, program activities or change management activities, which also form part of the program. So projects are organized within programs, but programs include other things in addition to projects. So what about program management? PMI talks about the application of knowledge, skills, and principles to a program in order to achieve the program's objectives and achieve benefits and control not available by managing the components individually. APM says something similar, but it talks about achieving beneficial change through managing the related projects and subsidiary change management activities. And OGC, the same kind of thing, but it adds this interesting phrase at the end, achieving outcomes and realizing benefits of strategic importance. And I think we're familiar with this idea too. Program management is different from project management because programs connect projects and change management activities to strategy. So programs sit in the middle of projects and other components organized into programs, and as the programs are managed, then the programs contribute to realizing benefits of strategic importance, strategic benefits. Now that's an important concept when we come to consider program risk management. If programs are not projects, not even big ones, and program management is not the same as project management, because programs have this particular place sitting between projects and strategy, how do we manage the risk on programs? I think you'll agree, if any of you have been involved in programs at all, that programs are risky and that risk needs to be managed. And so how do we do risk management within a program? For many years, and I think particularly PMI was guilty of this, and I speak as a PMI fellow as well as an honorary fellow of the APM. I think the only person in the UK to hold both of those honours, which is an interesting position to be in. But certainly PMI in its early days thought that program risk management was just the same as project risk management, just done on a different scale, on a different level. We just did everything bigger, which perhaps is something of the American influence within PMI coming out. I don't think that's true. I think program risk management has a different aim and a different scope from risk management in projects. And because of that different aim and scope, we need a different approach, which requires a different set of tools and techniques. Now, within the time limitation of our webinar here, I don't have time particularly to talk about tools and techniques, but we can talk about the different aim and scope of program risk management and also the different approach that we need to take in managing risk in programs. So program risk management is not the same as project risk management. And I think those three important points, programs are not projects, program management is not project management, and program risk management is not project risk management, are important starting points for us, because we tend to have in APM and in the project-based industry at large, a project-focused mindset. And we've been so used to being the Association for Project Management, and the kind of key discipline is project management, that this idea that programs are somehow different sometimes catches us out. So what is the aim and the scope of program risk management, and how is that different from project risk management? Well, first of all, the aim obviously is to manage risks at the program level, and not necessarily at the level of the components within the program. So we expect project risk management to manage the risks within the project in the same way that program risk management manages risks at the program level. Now, we have a general definition of risk here, which we can find in the APM body of knowledge and also in the PMI body of knowledge and the PMI standard for program management, which we could generalize like this. Risk is an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on one or more objectives. And as Vivian said, one of the important things to remember is that not all risks are bad, that some risks have a positive effect on objectives. We call those opportunities, in the same way that some risks have a negative effect on objectives, and we call those threats. So risk is a double-sided concept that includes both upside risk and downside risk, opportunities as well as threats. That's not really the point of this presentation, so we won't labor that point anymore, just to remind you that good things can happen unexpectedly, and risk management has the goal of trying to maximize the probability and impact of positive opportunities, as well as minimizing the probability and impact of negative threats. Now, here's a generic definition of risk: an uncertain event or condition that, if it happens, affects objectives. If we're talking about project risk management, a project risk is any uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, affects project objectives. So what's a program objective? A program risk. A program risk is just the same. A program risk is an uncertain event or condition that, if it occurs, has a positive or negative effect on program objectives. And in fact, we could switch out that word to define any kind of risk. We could talk about strategic risk as being uncertainties that affect strategic objectives. We can talk about technical risk affecting technical objectives. Environmental risk is uncertainty that affects environmental objectives. And in fact, personal risk are uncertainties that might affect my personal objectives. So we just switch out that colored word and we can define different types of, or different levels of risk. And the definition is linked to the objectives. Risk is an uncertainty that affects objectives. Program risk is an uncertainty that affects program objectives. So because programs are not projects, then automatically program risk management is at a different level from project risk management, because program objectives sit above project objectives. So in terms of our scope, the scope of program risk management, we're looking for any risk that can affect achievement of one or more program objectives. And hopefully that's clear. So if we're looking in our program risk register and we find uncertainties that can affect projects, or can affect strategy, or can affect anything other than program objectives, they don't belong to the program. We have to have uncertainties that, if they occur, will affect our program objectives for those things to be within scope for us. Now, because programs sit between projects and strategy, that means that risk can approach programs from three separate directions, up, down, and sideways. So if we think of here in this diagram, programs sitting above the component level, where we have the related projects and the related change management activities or operational activities or other program activities, and perhaps sub-programs as well. And programs sit above those components, but programs deliver benefits at the strategic level. So programs sit below strategy, programs contribute to strategy. Then the risks which affect us at the program level, risks which could influence our achievement of program objectives, include big risks and groups of risks that can be escalated or aggregated from the component level. Things that come up from the projects and related activities, but could have an influence at the program level, not just with impacts limited to the component level. In the same way, if there are risks which arise from the strategic level, which can affect our program, then those things also need to be managed at the program level. There are uncertainties that arise from the strategic level, but if they impact program level objectives, then they're program risks. And we talk about escalating and aggregating risks from below. We talk about delegating risks from above. And then in addition to that, sort of from up and from down, we also have risks that can attack us on the program level itself, risks that are specific to the program and the management of the program itself. So we have these three different levels of risks that can influence our achievement of program objectives. And I should say that all of this is now reflected in the APM Body of Knowledge, the 6th edition, and you'll find this described in section 3.5, the risk management section, in a little bit of detail. We're just unpacking that particular section. So let's look at these three different directions in turn. We'll start with risks that come up from the component level. Then we'll think about risks that drop down on us from above, from the strategic level. And then we'll look at risks that come in at the program level itself. So risks from below. We're often used to leading our programs through a situation that we think is reasonably straightforward, and then something happens, something that we weren't quite expecting, and we're affected by things that were beneath us. Don't worry, no ducklings were harmed in the making of this slide. It's only Photoshop, so you needn't worry about that. Or we might think about this situation where we're quite gaily making progress until something unexpected leaps up from the waters below. What kind of things are we thinking about? Well, when we're thinking about risks that are escalated and aggregated from the components which make up the program, there are four basic sources. If we think about the projects that make up that are contained within our program, sometimes we have large project risks whose impact is so big that it doesn't just affect the project, but if this risk occurred either for good or for bad, threats or opportunities, that it would also affect our ability to achieve the program objectives. So large project risks need to be aggregated. In addition, in the project level, not just big ones that could affect the program on their own, we might find there are groups of risks within one project or a group of projects which all affect the same program objectives. And so they're related together. And if they happen, if one happens because they're related, then it triggers the other risks in related projects. And so we find that these together have a bigger impact on the program than they do on the individual project that contains them. And so we can aggregate those risks if they have an effect at the program level. Of course, programs don't only contain projects, programs contain other things. But one thing we must remember about projects is it's not just the risks within the project that could affect the program if they're big enough or if there are enough of them which are similar. If the project itself fails, then that could affect the achievement of the program. Now, the riskiness of the overall project is different from the individual risks that you find within the project. And again, this is something which is explained in the risk management section of the APM Body of Knowledge, that's section 3.5, that there are two different concepts of risk, and we'll discuss this a little bit later on. There are individual risks within a project, and then we have the overall riskiness of the project. And if the project itself is risky, then that will affect our achievement of the project's goals, which in turn would affect our ability to achieve the program goals. So if the project itself is too risky, then that needs to be managed at the program level. And then lastly, the fourth area is components of the program which are not projects. And similarly, if we have large or related risks within non-project components, these can be escalated or aggregated to the program level. So we might just show that on a diagram. Before we get to the diagram, if we want to escalate or aggregate risks from project level to program level, we need to know at what point the project risk becomes big enough to be affecting the overall program objectives. And so this idea of a risk threshold that sits between the project and the program is something that we need to consider. And I'll come back to that again a little bit later on. We also know how to decide how big a risk is when we're talking about large risks or small risks. And again, that's something which is fairly standard project risk management. So here's a diagram that says the same kind of thing about escalation and aggregation of our project risks. We might have a whole bunch of risks in our project risk register, which are different sizes. The ones that remain below the project program risk threshold, so their impact is only of a size that would affect the project, but it wouldn't affect the overall program, then these risks are retained by the project and we're not interested at program level. Sometimes we find within the project risk register risks whose impact is so large that it not only would affect the project, but it would affect the individual risk, would affect the program as well if it occurs. So these are the risks that we escalate if their impact breaches the project program risk threshold. And then we might find in the project risk register a range of smaller risks that are related, perhaps within a single project or perhaps across different projects. And they might be related because they have the same cause, or because they affect the same objective, or because they have similar characteristics. And what we might be able to do in this case, if we recognize that these risks are linked together, is aggregate them and see how big their aggregated impact might be. And if their aggregated impact breaches the project and program risk threshold, then they also need to be addressed at the program level. Now, in order to do this, we need to know how to relate risks together. And risks can be related by their source, as I say, and this might be found in a risk breakdown structure. Risks can be related by the effect that they might have, the area of the project that could be affected, and we might find that by mapping risks into the work breakdown structure. Or we might relate them together by the type of impact that they could have, if they're cost risks, or schedule risks, or performance risks, or safety risks, or reputation risks. And the use of a risk impact breakdown structure, a RIBS, might be useful in this context. So we've got here a range of different ways of getting individual risks out of the project level into the program level. If they're big enough, they breach the threshold, and so we need to see them and escalate them to program level. Or if they group together and together they have a big enough impact, then we aggregate them and again we address them at program level. But this all depends on understanding what this project and program risk threshold is. How do we know how much risk is sufficient that can be managed within the project level, and how do we know at what point risks become big enough to be escalated to the program? We'll come back to that. Really important question. So now we've dealt with risks that come up from the component level, either big ones or ones that are aggregated together. And of course, sometimes we have individual project risks or component risks which are so big that actually they go right through the program level and affect overall strategy. And these need to be escalated not to the program, but in fact to the strategic risk management process, or perhaps we might call that the enterprise risk process. So that's dealt with risks that come up from below. What about risks that might drop on us from above and spoil our day? Sometimes other people are doing things higher than us in the organization, which we're not aware of, excuse me, which could actually affect our ability to achieve our program. And what we need to do as we're making progress along our program is to just be alert to the things that are happening at the strategic level above us, in case any of those might drop into our program and have an effect that we need to be aware of. So what kind of risks can come down to us from the strategic level? Well, risks will be delegated to program level from strategy if either they affect program objectives or they require program level action or ownership. And this can arise from decisions about scoping, decisions about prioritization, decisions about changes in strategy or changes in our contractual or partnering arrangements, changes in the regulatory framework, all sorts of things which are managed at the strategic level, could be actually relevant for us to understand and manage, take ownership for at the program level. So this means we need to know about the threshold when risks are going to be dropped on us from the strategic level to the program level. If there are things that are so big that they only affect corporate strategy, then they should be managed at strategic level. But if there are risks that are identified at strategic level that could affect us in our programs, then they come below our threshold, then we need to manage them as well. And that means we need to have clear communication lines between the program and the strategic levels. We should have access to the C-suite either directly or through our program sponsors, and that's really important. And it also means that when people at the strategic level are delegating risks to us for management at program level, that they're not abdicating responsibility, they also are being aware of and monitoring and keeping tabs of the risks that they've delegated down to us. So that's why we need to communicate in both directions, that we've accepted a risk for management at program level, and we're also going to report back on how that's going. So we've talked about risks that drop down on us from above and risks that creep up on us from below. What about risks at program level, where we think we're making great progress in our program and suddenly we discover that we're not actually looking in the right direction, like these two guys? Something is about to happen at the same level of us as us that we need to be aware of. So what kind of things should we manage at program level? Risks that are nothing to do with our components, our related projects or other program components, and they're nothing to do with strategy. They just come at us from the program level. Risks that arise within the program level, of course, includes both threats and opportunities, as we've said before, and they come across all of the risk types within the risk breakdown structure. So we might have technical risks or management risks or commercial risks or external risks and any of the subtypes within that overall risk breakdown structure. But particularly we might find risks that come because of interfaces between program components, issues to do with relative prioritization or resource conflicts and so on. And then there are things that are pure program risks that come about from our execution of the program itself, in terms of communication issues, in terms of interfaces elsewhere outside of the program, and so on. So we need to be aware of what's happening around us with our various components, and also what's happening within the program itself. So the challenge of program risk management, we're talking about the aim and the scope here. The aim is to manage any risk that could affect program objectives. And in terms of scope, that includes risks that are escalated to us from below, but it also includes risks that are delegated to us from above, and then also the risks which come at us on the level of the program itself, which means it's quite challenging. It's actually more complex than project risk management. And that means that we need a different approach to manage risk at program level. Program risk management needs to be different from project risk management. But what might we say about the approach to managing risk at programs, which is different from project risk management? Here we've got to recognize there are two different types of risk management that we need to do at the program level. First of all, there are the individual risks which arise from our component projects and other activities, or which are dropped down from the strategy level, or which attack us on our program level. We have individual risks, threats and opportunities. But also we have to, as program managers, manage the overall riskiness of our program. And these are different challenges. So on the one hand, we have to manage, maybe there's 10, 20, 50, 100 individual risks that are on our program risk register. But we're also accountable to our program sponsor, to senior management, to our customers and our stakeholders for managing the overall riskiness of the program. And I'd like to suggest to you that this requires two separate approaches, which we might call implicit risk management in the way that we manage overall riskiness of the program, and then explicit risk management for individual risks, threats and opportunities and other uncertainties. So what do we mean by implicit and explicit? Implicit is the way that we deal with the overall riskiness, the risk of the program itself. And we do this through the way that we build the program, the selection of the components, the related projects and other activities which go to make up the project, go to make up the program. And so the content and context of the program itself will shape the amount of risk that the program contains. And we can modify and moderate component selection as we go through the program if we find that the program's overall risk exposure is either too high, we might have to remove or reduce some components, or perhaps we find that the overall program risk exposure is too low and we're not taking enough risk to enable us to achieve the strategic benefits and value that's required, and we might want to take more risk. And so we might add into the program some more risky components. So we can build the program to achieve the required return with an acceptable level of risk exposure. And this has a jargon name. This is called risk efficiency. Risk efficiency is the measure of the relationship between risk and return within the context of a set of components. Now, risk efficiency as an idea was originated in, I think it was 1958, by an economist called Harry Markowitz. And he actually invented what's called modern portfolio theory, but it was in the context of financial investments. And he was talking about how you build a portfolio of financial investments, which overall gives you the required level of return by taking a balanced risk across the portfolio. And so risk efficiency initially was developed in the financial sector. In the last, well, probably 5 or 6 years, we've been thinking about how we apply that risk efficiency concept within programs and, of course, obviously within portfolios of projects. And so it's a question of how do we maintain the required level of return whilst understanding what risk exposure is associated with that. And once we know the risk efficiency requirement, then we can choose the components within our program to get the right level of risk in order to achieve the required return. So this is part of our implicit program risk management. We're not managing individual risks. We're managing how risky the program is by considering the components or the content and the context of the program itself. This means that we need to know what our organizational risk threshold is and have the ability to understand how risky each program component is so that we can add together the risk exposure of each of our components and see if that sits within our overall organizational risk threshold. And this is the risk efficiency calculation. And so we're reviewing our overall program risk exposure as the program lifecycle continues, adjusting the mix of components as required to stay below that organizational risk threshold and still achieve the required return. So this is the risk efficiency challenge within implicit program management, which we addressed by a component selection of the content and context of the program. There's a second way in which implicit program risk management works, and that's in the execution of the program, and that's making sure that we keep the riskiness of the program within that overall threshold, which we do by the way that we structure the program. So incremental delivery of value and benefits by separating out our program into chunks or cycles or tranches will reduce our overall level of risk exposure. Again, we're not addressing individual risks, but by structuring the program and the way we deliver the program in a particular way, we're managing the risk profile of the whole program in order to stay within the overall risk threshold that's been set for us. And we can decouple the tranches or the chunks to create what we might call islands of stability. That phrase has been used in MSP previously, in order to say, well, here is a kind of safe area where we can isolate or insulate a part of the program and deliver that value without it being affected by other risks, and that will help us to create value and manage our overall risk exposure. Of course, this is based on the idea that programs are cyclic, that they have a plan, execute, deliver, review cycle, and so within that cyclic nature, the structure of the program itself de-risks the program so that we can manage the overall riskiness of the program as we go through the different cycles. Okay, so what we're doing here in this way of structuring the program in execution is to build flexibility and resilience into the way that the program is structured. So we've got two things that we're doing here in implicit program risk management. We're selecting the components in the way that we build the project in the first place in order to make sure that the overall program remains within our risk exposure threshold. And then as we execute the program by having incremental delivery and life cycle, then we're remaining flexible and resilient to manage risk exposure as we go along through the program. So that's implicit program risk management. And maybe some of that is new to you. Explicit program management is probably not new to you. Here we're talking about how we might address the individual risks within the program. These are the risks that are escalated from our component projects and other activities, risks that are delegated from the strategic level, or risks that are arriving at the program level itself. And here we use a structured process very similar to the project risk management process, where we launch the process by being clear about our objectives and scope. We identify threats and opportunities. We pick out the big ones through risk assessment and analysis. We develop appropriate responses and implement them. And then we review our risk exposure and update our risk assessment to see if it's working. And we learn lessons related to risk, like what risks were arising, what responses were working, and so on. And we have a cyclic process, very similar to the project risk management process. So you should be very familiar with that whole idea. So we have similar tools and techniques within the explicit program risk management approach that we would have in project risk management. So what we've got here is two distinct approaches to managing risk within programs. We've got implicit risk management, where we're considering the structure of the program, the scope of the program, the content and the context of the components. And here we're addressing the overall riskiness of the program. And then we have explicit risk management, which uses a standard cyclic risk management process, which addresses the individual risks that the program has to address. And you'll see that these are two quite different ways of thinking about risk, and the program manager has to be confident to manage risk in both ways. Okay, so I'm about to wrap up. This may sound interesting, it may sound new, it may sound exciting, but unfortunately, as I said at the beginning, risk management at the program level is still not very mature, and so we do still have a number of issues to address in order to make this work. And some of you may be more advanced in this than others, some of you may be already doing this. For others, if you want to implement this implicit explicit approach that we've talked about, these sorts of things you might need to give some attention to. We've talked about risk thresholds. How do you know when a risk is so big, a project risk, that it needs to be escalated from the project level to the program? Or how do you know when a risk which is at the strategic level actually can be managed safely at the program level? Where are those risk thresholds above and below the program? If we don't understand risk thresholds, then we might find that we're escalating and aggregating from below risks that should really be managed at the project and component level, or that we're accepting risks from above that really should be managed at the strategic level. So it's important for us to understand what those risk thresholds are. There are techniques and approaches to developing and understanding those based on risk appetite, which we don't have time to discuss just now, but which we need to understand. Secondly, we've mentioned this concept of risk efficiency, matching the amount of risk exposure with the required level of reward to make sure that we don't take too much risk and therefore prejudice the reward that we're taking, that we don't take too little risk and therefore not be able to achieve the level of reward and benefit that's required. To be able to implement that within programs, it sounds reasonably straightforward, at least I hope it does, but we do need to give some thought to how we measure the risk exposure of our components, for example, in a consistent way, how we measure the amount of reward that comes from the program, and how we build that risk efficiency model to map out the risk efficient frontier, where we understand how much risk is too much risk, how much reward is too little reward, and how to vary the structure of the program in order to achieve that. We do need to avoid the project mindset. I think a lot of people have come into programs from the world of projects. We think about programs as kind of super projects, as big projects, and we try to apply our project management methodology and approaches in programs at just a different level. And as we've seen, projects are not programs, project management is not program management, and project risk management is not program risk management. So if we go into our programs with a project mindset, then I think we are going to be in trouble. We have to make sure that program risk management isn't done in a silo. It's absolutely central to the success of the overall program. And so we need to interface risk management to the overall management of the program. This is a challenge for risk management at all sorts of levels, not just programs. But because we're using this explicit, implicit approach, then maybe this will help us to overcome this false boundary between risk management and the overall management of the program, because the implicit part of risk management in programs is thinking about the scope and the structure and the content and the context of the program, which are wider program management issues. So here's the final concluding assertions, if you like, statements. We know that programs are not projects, not even big ones. We know that programs are risky and that risk needs to be managed. And so we know that we need to do something about program risk. The implicit and explicit double level approach gives us a way into thinking about risk exposure within the program and risk exposure of the program, and hopefully will help you to think more widely about the challenge of managing risk in programs. It's not easy, it is possible, and there are some good techniques available out there. That brings me to the end of my presentation. I just refer you back to the 6th edition of the APM Body of Knowledge, section 3.5, Risk Management, which does have these sorts of ideas summarized in there, and there are some further references that you can look at within the body of knowledge. But I hope you found that presentation useful and interesting. I'm happy to take questions at this point. Hopefully you'll have been writing your questions into the question box so that Vivian can pick those up and feed them back to me. It's not too late to enter a question, so if you'd like to go ahead and do that, then we've left some time for dealing with questions, and I hope you found that useful. So Vivian, I'm finished. I'm going to pass over to you to handle the questions, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Hillson, for your presentation this afternoon. I'm sure the delegates found something to take away in them. One of the questions that's asked is, I'm working on global projects and programs, but the strategy keeps changing. Therefore, how do you manage the risks on a moving target on programs?
Yes, this is clearly one of the risks to the program, which comes down to us from the strategic level. And so it's certainly a risk that needs to be identified in the program risk register, that the strategy might change and therefore change the basis, the validation, the business case for the program itself. In terms of strategy or responses to manage that, I think here the program manager needs to depend on the program sponsor, on the business case owner, on those who have launched the program. You know, we don't execute our programs in isolation. Often programs are part of portfolios or they're part of departmental structures. And I think the program manager is not in a good place, is not really able to manage changes in corporate strategy alone. These come from people, you know, way above the pay grade of the program manager. But we do have allies. We should use our influence and use our network of influence within the organization. It is difficult, and the other thing we can do perhaps is to make the people who are responsible for strategy aware of the implications or the impact of their decisions. So when strategy changes and we see that changes the business case or the value outcome, the value proposal of our program, then we can model that and we can go back and say, if the strategy changes like this, the impact on my program is like this, are we sure we want to proceed? So making people aware of the implications of proposed changes in strategy. So I think those two things. One is using our allies elsewhere in the organization, particularly our program sponsor and business case owner, and making people aware of the implications of their decision might be ways to proceed. But it is very difficult. You know, strategy does change, and we have to respond to that. And sometimes we just have to suck it up and do it.
Someone's asking a question. This is new. Shouldn't the inherent risk of carrying out the program itself be managed by a portfolio rather than the program?
Well, It's interesting that this is an interesting question. Who is responsible for the overall delivery of the program? It's not the portfolio manager or the business case owner or the program sponsor. If you're the program manager, then you're responsible for delivering the benefits and outcomes of your program. And if that program itself fails, you are accountable for that. So you certainly need to be aware of the implicit or the inherent riskiness of your program. And sometimes there are risks where in terms of managing those implicit or inherent program level risks, you need your portfolio manager or program sponsor or business case owner to help you manage the risk, but still it's your risk because you own the program objectives, so you own the program risks. If a program risk is any uncertainty that if it occurs affects program objectives, then the owner of the objectives owns the risks. And so I would say that the program manager is responsible for identifying how risky the overall program is, and then for making let's say the portfolio manager aware of that, and then finding the right way to manage it, proposing some response strategies. And some of that response might be the responsibility, might be owned by the portfolio manager. Other things might be done within the program itself. So I don't think there's a clear, you always give it to the portfolio manager to deal with. It's his responsibility or her responsibility always. It depends on what the specific thing is. For example, you might be able to change the overall riskiness of your program, the inherent risk, by rescheduling some of your program components and changing the order of delivery of your sub-programs or your component projects. You might be able to reprioritize projects and programs, projects and sub-programs or other activities. You might be able to change the resource balance between your components, which is managing the overall riskiness of the inherent risk, to use Neil's term, the inherent risk of the program, but that's within the authority of the program manager to do. So I don't think it's always the case that you just pass these things up and say, this is too big for me, you have to deal with it. Sometimes that's true, but not always.
Yeah. Kim asks the question, how would you advise implementing this management of risk approach with a measure and declare a program, that is the technical progress, is on a reasonable and diverse basis with no contractual obligation to achieve a particular technical performance?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question. I don't have a lot of experience of those. They sound very nice programs to be on, I think. If you've just got a measure and declare and you don't have any hard performance targets to meet, you just spend the money and do what you can. And well, there must be risks in there somewhere, mustn't there? I think the approach is the same. You obviously clearly have objectives. I mean, I've come across this in pharmaceutical research and development programs, where you know that a lot of your component elements are going to fail, are not going to deliver. And so it's very hard to say out of your R&D, what value is going to be created, but you hope something will. Of course, it's quite possible at the end of the program period that nothing will be created because it's R&D. And so there's not a specific performance requirement that comes out from the R&D program. So there are different objectives, and I think always risk has to be related to objectives. But I'm afraid I don't have a really good answer to that because it's not really within my area of experience. Maybe somebody else has an answer to that, but I'm afraid it's not me. Sorry.
Yeah. Ashok asks a question. He says it sounds simple, but it says, how do we get others to accept a risk and become the owner of that risk?
Yes, the Risk Doctor motto is understand deeply so you can explain simply. And so a lot of the things, when we explain them, you say, oh, that sounds simple. And that's because we've done our job well, that we've done the hard thinking and synthesized a lot of ideas into a simple approach that you can put into practice. But often when we're dealing with people, this is one of the hardest areas, and persuading people to take ownership of a risk is one of those difficult areas. I think the answer is that risks are related to objectives, and whoever owns objectives owns the risk. So if you have a risk that could affect a part of your program which is owned by somebody particular, and maybe it's a particular project manager, or it's somebody, a technical expert, or it's a contractual department, if this risk could affect the objectives that they're responsible for delivering, then they should be interested in knowing what that risk is and seeing that it's managed effectively. And so if you tie risk ownership to the ownership of the objectives that would be affected if the risk happened, then people might be or should be more interested. My very small, short definition of risk is uncertainty that matters. It's uncertain, it may never happen, but if it happens, it matters because it'll affect an objective. And whenever we're communicating about risk, whether it's within our program team or to our component program project teams or to senior management, we have to communicate in terms that matter to them. So if I talk to a component project manager in terms of some program strategic benefits that they're not interested in, it doesn't matter to them, of course they won't take ownership. But if I talk to them in terms of their project objectives that matter to them, then they will be interested. So I think if risk is uncertainty that matters, when we're trying to get ownership, we have to make sure that it matters to them. If it matters to them, then they'll take ownership of it naturally.
Yeah. We've got a question from Sybil. How different would be a program risk register from a project risk register? And what type of extra information do we need in the program risk register?
That's a great question. I think basically they're the same. Obviously, the impact columns will be impact against program objectives and not necessarily impact, well, not against project objectives. But the extra information I think will be interesting would be the source of the risk, if this is an escalated aggregated risk from a project level, or if it's a delegated risk from strategic level, because I think we would manage those in different ways. And then we might also be thinking about the phase of the program that could be affected. If the program has a cyclic life cycle of designing and developing and delivering value and then going around again in loops, then to understand which tranche or which element of the program would be affected. So I think timing information we would add to a program risk register that wouldn't necessarily be in a project risk register. And there are two types of timing information that we might like to think about. One is the impact window. So when do we expect this risk to occur? And secondly is the action window. When do we have to do something in order to manage the risk effectively? And so obviously what we need to do is make sure that the action window is before the impact window. You know, it's not going to happen before we have a chance to do anything. And we can plot out then risks on a timeline where we can understand when we need to do things in order to address risks before they become critical. So I think the source of the risk would be an extra field to add in, and then the timing aspects of the risk would also be relevant. But apart from that, I think the content is pretty much the same: a unique identifier, a short description, a separation of the cause and the risk and the consequence, the probability of it occurring or the frequency with which it might occur, the impact against the objectives, a risk owner, an action strategy, and then details of the actions with action owners and a status. I think those sorts of standard fields in the risk register should occur at program risk register level as well.
Question. We just have one more question, I think, and then we'll sort of come to the end of the presentation. It says, to enable proactive and efficient program risk management, do you suggest a maximum number of risks that should be considered in the risk register? And if the register gets too large, do you suggest grouping risks to make the register manageable?
There's a simple answer. The answer is no. I really think we mustn't artificially limit the number of risks in the risk register. So if your risk genuinely has a very large number of risks, if your program really has a large number of risks, then we really are in trouble. You know, so we do need to know and be honest about it. It's like reporting the top 10. You know, if you report the top 10, what if there are 11 or 12 or 15 critical risks? Artificially limiting to the top 10, I think, is just hiding things. So I would always encourage full disclosure and transparency. and that's important in terms of understanding the true risk exposure of the program. But in terms of the optimum number to handle, that's a different question. Obviously, people have a limited span of attention and a limited amount of time and effort available to deal with risks, and so we mustn't overwhelm people. That's the purpose of the risk prioritization step, the qualitative risk assessment, where we deal with the big risks first, and also, as we were saying, with this timing element, to deal with the proximate, the risks that are likely to happen soon. You have to deal with those first as well. So I would say don't limit the numbers, but in terms of making sure that we get engagement, don't overwhelm people with too many risks. So that might mean filtering the risk register in terms of presenting it, and only showing people a kind of rolling wave of the risks that need to be dealt with immediately. In terms of grouping risks together, that might be useful again if we're reporting risk upwards, and we can group risks using the risk breakdown structure by their source, by the work breakdown structure, by the area affected, or by other components, other characteristics. But still, we want to manage the individual risks, the specific risks. We're not going to manage groups of risks. So grouping risks together, again, can hide detail and make it harder to actually manage the real risks themselves.
I would like to say, thank you again, Dr. Hillson. So we'll come now to the end of the presentation. So I'll just sort of have a few reminders for the delegates about the program SIG. Just once again, the nominations are open to join the Program Management SIG. And as I say, you've got 2 more days to sort of self-nominate yourselves. That will be on the 4th of July. And I will be publishing a blog after the presentation. And look out on the community page of the APM for the monthly blog from the Program Management SIG Committee. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. I hope you found that interesting and useful. And do feel free to get in touch, and we'll answer your questions as we can. Thank you very much, Vivian, for hosting this, and goodbye from me.